Okay, so this is the outline of the presentation. First, we'll respond to the question, why look at China anyway, in this context, in the context of environmental management and competitiveness. Then we'll look at how the government has responded to the challenges posed by the environmental problems in China. Then we'll look at what the corporations in China feel in terms of environment from their external environment, because that is essentially what's driving the process in China. And then a little bit about China's behavior with respect to ISO 14001, and I'll talk more about that later. And cleaner production, I'll talk more about that as well. And then we'll just wrap up by summarizing the key points. A word of background about my relationship with China. Maybe you find this curious. In 1986, of course, I knew where China was on the map, and I knew something about Chinese food because I was raised in New York City and lived near San Francisco, and New York City has a very thriving Chinatown, and so does San Francisco. So, I knew something about food. I knew how to hold chopsticks and all of that. But I didn't know much more. So I got a letter. Now, for the younger students, you probably have trouble imagining this, but there was a time when the only time that you could contact somebody overseas, unless you had a lot of money to make a phone call, was either by telex using Western Union. This is before fax. You remember. Either by telex or people actually wrote letters. So I got this dusty envelope that looked like it had really been around the globe one day, and it said, Dear Professor Ortolano, we just finished a translation of your textbook. I wrote a textbook on environmental management. And we just finished the translation of your textbook, and we were wondering if you would write an introduction. So, I knew that when I produced the textbook that I more or less signed away any of my rights to the material. So I called the publisher, John Wiley & Sons, and I said, I gave them the circumstances, what, am I allowed to do this or not? And they said, wait, we have to talk with the lawyers and so on. So they came back, and 2 days later, they called me back and said, you can do whatever you want because it's hopeless. We'll never find any royalty money from China, so just do what you want. So I wrote a 3-page introduction. I sent it back, and who knows, where it went and all of that. But eventually, 6 months later, I got another letter. It said, Dear Professor Ortolano, we'd like to invite you and your wife to come to China for as long as you want, and we would like you to teach a course, and would you be willing to do that? Not ever having been to China and having a kind of adventurous spirit about travel, I said, sure. And I went and taught a course with about a little bit more students, let's say about 80 students. There are probably about 60 people here. About 80 students from all over China. During the day, I gave the course. At night, I said I wanted to come groups of 5 or 6 to the hotel so that I could learn about China. And that's when it all started. I started to do research on environmental management in China. So that's the link with China. It's a very deep link, and I've had many students from China that have done research, and also many Americans who have done research in China. Of course, they can't do research in China unless they're fluent in Mandarin, because otherwise it's impossible. So, why are we looking at China? Well, you probably know from the newspapers that the problems are staggering. It turns out that China has regulatory programs that are unique and very progressive in many respects, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, in the context of this group, there's significant green supply chain pressure from multinationals and also significant pressure from NGOs, both international NGOs and also domestic NGOs in China. And China is interesting because of their strong embrace of cleaner production and ISO. It turns out, just a preview, that more companies in China, by far, not even close to the second, more companies in China are certified to ISO 14001 than any other country. I think it's almost twice as many as the number 2 country, which I think is Japan, but I have some statistics later. Okay, and you know this part better than I do about China's role in the world commercial markets. The fact that domestic pollution in China is not just Chinese. We worry about it in the west coast of the United States, worry about particulates and other heavy metals and so on coming over. And in addition, China is interesting because the Chinese aspire to be innovators with respect to environment. And you see that in terms of their regulatory structure, for one, and also what their companies are doing. Now, this is the part that's grim for China. These are just some photos. You may have seen things like this. This is a photo from the air trying to look at Beijing, and you see that cover. This is the Yangtze River, titanium pollution. Titanium is very nasty stuff. Here's another picture of a power plant in eastern Mongolia. There's one place in China called Taiwan City, which you cannot see from satellites. It's just completely covered over. So, now, given this challenge, what has the Chinese government done? And that's what we'll talk about for a few minutes. I don't think there are probably any questions about China because the pollution in China, because you probably read about it all the time, I assume. I mean, it's widely known. Certainly, if anybody has ever spent any time in Beijing, I know there must be a few Chinese students here. No? Any from China? Okay. Oh, several students from China. So you know what the air pollution is like in Beijing. We don't have to talk about that. It's really bad. It's bad. So what has the government done? The government has interesting programs. Some are traditional and some are innovative and some are a little bit, we would call, maybe out of the box, you know, just really beyond innovative. So let's talk about the traditional programs. The traditional programs consist of standards just like the ones you have in France and other countries. These are standards on the ambient environment, which is to say the air around us, the water in the streams and the lakes. And then there are standards on discharges as well. The challenge that China has with the standards is that they're really not enforced very well. And one of the reasons is related to markets, it turns out, because the second of the approaches that they followed are market-based strategies. When people talk about market-based strategies for pollution control, there are usually two things that come to mind. One is the tax program. For those of you who studied economics, the taxes are sometimes called Pigouvian taxes after the British economist Pigou. And the other is what we now refer to as cap and trade, early versions called things like marketable permits to pollute and so on. Now, the reason that the standards and so on are not well enforced is because of the tax program. China had a tax program, a tax on pollution, since the 1970s. Now, what happened is that the taxes were set very low. And the reason the taxes were set low is because the finance ministry, which is much more powerful than the environment ministry could ever imagine being, the finance ministry said, well, we'll let you set the tax, but you can't set it too high because it'll slow down the economy. So they set the tax very low. It turns out that the environmental protection bureaus, this is at the local level, there's a Ministry of Environmental Protection, but all of the activity takes place at the subnational level. The Ministry of Environmental Protection only has a staff of 300. What they do is largely propose regulations and laws and so on like that, but they don't do any implementation. All the implementation is done locally. It turns out that the tax, for the greater part of the history of the program, the tax revenues would go directly to the Environmental Protection Bureau. And the consequence of that was when it came to implementing the standards and the taxes and so on, the Environmental Protection Bureaus only had one thing in mind, which is collecting revenues. Okay? So what they would do is they would go to a polluter. What's your name? Ehom? Yeah. Okay, so Ehom is running a factory, and I go to her and I say, ooh, I see that you're violating your standards, so you're going to have to pay a tax. And, you know, you should be really meeting the standards. So Ehom says, well, I have no trouble paying the tax, but it's really hard for me to meet the standard because that means I have to put in a lot of equipment, and if I do, I may have to lay off some workers and so on. So she pays me the tax, and I'm the Environmental Protection Bureau. I go home. Somebody says, is she violating? I said, no, she's fine. She paid her tax. That becomes the mentality of the agency. So you have a program that was set up with a goal to improve the environment, but the goal gets subverted or undermined because of the incentive structure of the agency. So now the agency's main goal is to collect the tax. So as a result, the standards are not enforced. The tax program is enforced, but it's easy to pay the tax because it's so low. So as a result, that's completely ineffective. The tradable permits program, they tried to do the equivalent of cap and trade, borrowing from the US model. In the US, by the way, you probably, if I say cap and trade, does that mean anything to people? Is that? Maybe explain it. Okay, okay.
Maybe they know the European market, ETS.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're maybe probably to provide some
yeah, okay. So the short, thank you very much. The short explanation for the program in China that started some years ago and failed was modeled after the US program that began in 1990. This was an attempt by the United States to satisfy commitments to the Canadian government because what we were doing was acidifying their lakes in the east coast of Canada and also the northeast of the United States because of power plants in the middle of the country. And the wind was blowing towards the east. So it was driving the sulfur, the sulfur dioxide pollutants long range, you know, over more than 1,000 miles, and it was being deposited in Canada and the US, in the Northeast. So under the first President Bush, he told his Environmental Protection Agency head, he said, I want you to fix this problem, but let's use the markets. So this was a fellow by the name of Bill Riley, who was conservative Republican, but not, he was a conservative in the sense of Chirac, you know, close to the middle, to the right of the middle, but not evangelical Christian, all the way over to the extreme right, the way we have it now, you know, where, you know, Romney is against environment, in favor of anything that involves oil or gas or whatever, or coal. You know, we didn't, not like that. He was closer to the center. So, so this fellow said, well, I read, you know, that you can set up a program where you give the polluting power companies rights to pollute on some basis or another. And once they have them, they would be inspired or motivated to clean up, because then, if they didn't use all the rights they had, they could sell them to firms that were not motivated or where it was too expensive to clean up. So this program of tradable rights to issue SO2 or sulfur dioxide pollution turned out to be very successful. Why? Because it triggered market forces, and it led to all kinds of innovation on the part of companies, for example, that were manufacturing the devices that would clean up the sulfur dioxide. The price of those devices went way down. And it turns out, in the end, that the program cost was about half of what it would have been if they used direct regulation. Now, the European Union emission trading system, which is on carbon dioxide and equivalents of carbon dioxide with other greenhouse gases, was, I mean, the people were motivated by this model in the US that was so effective in terms of driving down costs, unleashing market forces, and so on. Well, the US and China had a reciprocal program where they were exchanging information and so on, and the Chinese were very interested in trying to use market forces, so they tried to use the same program to deal with their acid rain problem, but it failed. And one of the reasons it failed was because you need 24/7, you know, all-day continuous monitoring in order for the program to work, and they didn't have the monitoring devices and so on. But never mind, China today is launching, or has launched this year, a pilot program for CO2, creating CO2 markets in several provinces and some of the larger cities. So you see, the Chinese officials are very progressive. I mean, the U.S., for example, this is completely unheard of. One, we don't have anything like a Pigouvian tax, impossible, because it includes the word tax, and anytime you include the word tax, it's more or less a non-starter in the U.S. Second, we looked like we might have a debate on cap and trade, but that went away, and there's not even one word about cap and trade anymore in the U.S. But here, the Chinese are innovating with pilots and so on. They want to see if it works. Well,
the main challenge in general, even in China, is the volatility of the market. The volatility.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are so many market design problems with so many market design issues with how you set up the program. Like some of the issues in the EU system related to volatility have been to, for example, in the beginning, they didn't allow banking, and so the value of those permits expired. They dropped to near zero and so on. Yeah.
The Chinese government wants, I think, maybe you know that better than me, wants to put a sort of cap on the price and
the base as well. Yeah. Well, they saw what happened in Europe. So, you know, they're going to try to design it differently. But these are matters, I mean, we could say that these are matters of program design. I prefer to think of them as large-scale experiments. And, you know, maybe, you know, 15 or 20 years from now, you know, we'll know very well how to do it. But in the meantime, you know, there's going to be some bumps. Because this is not easy to do. Because the reason is because of people like you. Because as soon as there are rules, then all the companies have to figure out how it is that they could live with the rules. And, you know, sometimes the companies get very clever with how to, I mean, all the time working within the system, but ways of taking advantage, especially the Wall Street speculators. I mean, this is like become the main line of business for them, speculating in permits. But anyway, that's off topic. We're coming back now because I want, after all, I want you to be able to answer the question about Pakistan, and we'll never do that if we talk about cap and trade. Okay, so anyway, they're progressive, but they haven't progressed much. I mean, in other words, they have ideas and experiments. The tax program was innovative, but it failed because of the subversion of the original objective. The first tradable permit program failed because of the absence of monitoring devices and a few other reasons. Now they have carbon trading on an experimental basis. So none of that's working very well. Information disclosure, they have environmental impact assessment requirements the same way you have in Europe, all over Europe. They have a program where they call Green Watch, which is one of these out-of-the-box programs where they'll give companies color-coded ratings and then announce in the newspapers what the, you know, for the largest companies, what their ratings are. And it's a program where they will, it's an experimental program where what they'll do is tell the companies, look, if we were to announce the ratings tomorrow, you were going to get a black mark or a red mark, which is bad. If you want, you know, you can make some improvements, and within 6 months, we'll check you again. Maybe we could raise you to a yellow, or if you're really good, we can give you a green, so that you'll have a high rating and so on. So these are kind of an experimental program, but it's not going very, it hasn't gone very far. So you could say that the government response has been robust, but ineffective in terms of real change on the ground. The latest change that they have implemented with the 12th five-year plan has promise, because what it does is it ties the promotions of local officials to environmental performance. Local officials have targets that they have to meet, and if they don't meet the targets, these are hard targets. Before, they used to be soft targets. Like if you didn't meet your environmental target to clean up so much SO2, or the other one they do is chemical oxygen demand, which is a measure of water pollution. If you didn't meet your targets for environment, you get a smack on the wrist before. But if you didn't meet your targets for GDP, you're not getting promoted. And you may even get fired. So now what they've done in the 12th five-year plan is to raise environment to the same level, not that it counts the same weight, but it's at the same level. That is, if you fail to meet your environmental targets on sulfur dioxide and chemical oxygen demand, it's going to look very bad for you in terms of your career. I mean, you may get fired, or you may stay in your job and not get a promotion for 3 years, waiting for the next cycle, and so on. So the local officials, who are, by the way, in China, the subnational governments, that is to say provincial, municipal, township, and all the rest, those are the people that run the place on a day-to-day basis. And it's the mayors and the provincial leaders and so on that have, each of them is like a little emperor. And so these promotion standards are on these little emperors. So we can expect maybe in 4 or 5 years that we'll see some change on the ground with respect to these two pollutants. But there are a lot of other pollutants. Anyway, that's for the future.